Welcome, everyone, to the University of New Mexico Law Mental Health Series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This series is run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences of the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box anytime you feel comfortable. We do tend to hold those until the end. We do try to get to as many as possible, but oftentimes it's just not possible to get to all the questions we have. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet that's posted in the chat box shortly. If you're pursuing APA continuing education credits, the link for that will also be in the chat box, but near the end of the talk or on the last 5 minutes of the presentation. Make sure you check that link before you leave the webinar. Make sure you bookmark it if you're not going to open it yet, and save your certificate after you complete your survey because we don't have access to those after the fact. The recording for this week's talk should be available on our YouTube page later this week, and the PowerPoint slides will also be acceptable for people that are registered for the series later this week as well. If you missed last week's talk in the series, Dr. Ray Ann Anderson's inspiring talk on how we measure sexual victimization and its impact on disclosure and equity issues should be available on our YouTube channel. And as a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Carol Holden, who will be discussing issues in juvenile violence risk assessment. But circling back to this week, I'm very excited to introduce you to today's speaker, who will be updating us on ins and outs about the ever discussed updates in the APA specialty guidelines for forensic psychology. This is Dr. Dave DeMatteo. Dr. Dave DeMatteo is a professor of psychology and professor of law at Drexel University, and also the director of their JD and Ph.D. program in law and psychology. His research interests include mental health law, psychopathic personality, diversion programs, and forensic mental health assessment. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed articles, over 50 book chapters, and 12 books. He's the former president of APLS, the American Psychology Law Society, and the American Board of Forensic Psychology. He consults with city agencies, state agencies, legislators, correctional facilities, and law enforcement. He conducts forensic mental health assessments of adults and adolescents on a variety of legal issues, and has testified as an expert witness in state and federal courts. With all that free time that he clearly has available, he also recently began his 6th-year term as editor-in-chief of Law and Human Behavior, and is, of course, chair of the committee to revise the APA specialty guidelines for forensic psychology. So Dr. DeMatteo, Dave, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, we're very thankful for you joining this series and sharing your expertise with us, and also being willing to be forthcoming and sharing all of these unique ins and outs that you have privy to. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
Well, thank you, Anthony. I appreciate that kind introduction, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today about the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology. I actually gave one of these talks a little over 4 years ago. It was March of 2020. If you think back to what was taking place in the world in March of 2020, you realize it was a much different time, much different place. And this lecture series, like many of the speakers have commented on before, has really made an amazing contribution to the field. So I just want to thank Anthony and his staff for organizing this, and thank the University of New Mexico for sponsoring this series. So this is the first opportunity I've had to talk about the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology in a public venue, and really looking forward to this as an opportunity to spark some dialogue, to hear your experiences, to get a lot of feedback on this process. There will be more opportunities for you to give your feedback more formally. There will be at least one public comment period. I'll be presenting on the guidelines in other venues, but this is a good opportunity to hear from folks who are doing this type of work, whether it's assessment, research, teaching, consulting, and to provide us with your input. That's what's going to really make these guidelines the most useful as we keep going. My email is on the last slide. I've given you my Drexel email, as well as an email account that we established specifically for the Specialty Guidelines Revisions Committee. Feel free to use either of those and contact me with questions, feedback, anything that you think might be useful, or anything I can help with after this presentation. Okay, this is the information you already heard about continuing education credits. I have no financial disclosures to report. Neither me nor anyone on the committee gets any financial compensation for working on the specialty guidelines. This is the standard disclaimer. So these are views. These are my views, not necessarily the views, policies, and positions of the University of New Mexico. I should also say that even though I'm chair of the Specialty Guidelines Revisions Committee, I'm not speaking for the committee in every instance, and I'll try to make it clear when I am. So these are the three learning objectives today. The first thing I want to do is describe the history and role of the specialty guidelines in the practice of forensic psychology. In various conversations I've had with people over the years, there's been some confusion in terms of the applicability of the specialty guidelines. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time contextualizing the specialty guidelines and talking a little bit about the applicability and enforcement of specialty guidelines in the field. And then the second thing we'll discuss are key ethical and practice-related guidance that's provided by the guidelines. And if you're familiar with the guidelines, you'll recall that they cover a wide range of activities. And so we're going to talk about what those activities are and how they are regulated by the specialty guidelines, and whether the specialty guidelines should be addressing such a wide range of activities. And then finally, we're going to talk about gaps in the current specialty guidelines and how those gaps potentially could be addressed in this revisions process. So as you can imagine, there's been a lot of changes over the past decade plus that we've had the current specialty guidelines in place. And some of those changes are going to be reflected in the revised specialty guidelines. So I'm going to throw a lot of information at you towards the end of this presentation about various considerations, things that we are thinking about in terms of including in the specialty guidelines. That's the kind of stuff where we can really use your feedback. So please share if you feel comfortable doing so. So before we get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the passing of Don Bursoff. His work in ethics was foundational for a lot of what we'll talk about in the specialty guidelines. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Don and his many achievements. Don was trained as a psychologist and a lawyer. He was the first general counsel, the first in-house lawyer for the American Psychological Association. And in that capacity, he wrote many briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States. He was a champion for underserved and marginalized populations dating back to the 1960s. He fought for the rights of women, the LGBTQIA plus community, adolescents. He was really ahead of his time in many ways in arguing for social reform. And he also trained generations of law psychology students. He directed 3 different JD Ph.D. programs. I have the privilege of directing the JD Ph.D. program at Drexel. That is the current iteration of a program that Don started many years ago. In fact, I met Don over 30 years ago when he accepted me into the JD Ph.D. program in law and psychology that was originally offered with MCP Hahnemann University and Villanova Law School. And after some university changes, that became the Drexel program that I have the privilege to direct. So he passed away on March 26th, a little over a month ago, and I thought it was appropriate to take a moment to just honor his legacy. Okay, there's no good segue, so I will just keep going. So this is what I want to do today, and I should note that this is probably a different talk than what you're used to in this seminar series. I won't be talking about research. There won't be anything empirical. There's nothing that resembles any statistics, and I'm not focusing on any circumscribed particular area of practice, but I do think it's foundational. I do think it's going to have utility for forensic practitioners, again, broadly defined. And I mentioned before, and it's worth repeating, that I do have some utilitarian goals for this. So not only do I want to be transparent about where we are in the revisions process and where we're going, but it's really important for us to get feedback. So I'm hoping that this will generate some dialogue. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the history of the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology. I think it's important for you to understand where we came from and where the guidelines came from to understand where we are now and where we're hoping the guidelines will take us with the current revision. I will update you on the status of the specialty guidelines revisions. This is, for several reasons we'll discuss, our progress has been limited by several external barriers. And so I'll talk to you about what those barriers are and some options that we have in terms of moving forward. We'll look at relevant considerations in revising the specialty guidelines. As you will see, there's a lot of procedural considerations, substantive considerations, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what those are. And then we'll talk about next steps in the revisions process. We still have a lot of work to do. We have a relatively limited amount of time, and I want to talk about some options that we see moving forward. Okay, so to keep things straight, I'm going to be talking about 3 different versions of the specialty guidelines. So this first version, the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists, was published in 1991. So that's the first version. The second version is the current version that's in effect, which was adopted by APA in 2011. And then the third version are the revised guidelines that we're working on. So I'm going to go through them in sequence, and I'm going to start with the first version of the specialty guidelines. And the idea behind the first version of the specialty guidelines was to provide more specific guidance for forensic psychologists. So there was a committee put together in the late 80s, and the idea was the ethics code doesn't provide a lot of guidance for the APA ethics code, doesn't provide a lot of guidance for forensic psychologists. So this was the first attempt to provide forensic specific ethical guidance for forensic psychologists. It was time. It was, by the time we hit the late 80s, the field of forensic psychology had experienced tremendous growth in terms of law psychology training programs, the development of specialized journals, the development of tests. Psychologists were being recognized more by courts as experts. You might recall it was only in the early 1960s in the Jenkins case where psychologists were initially recognized as having the expertise to testify about mental health conditions. 20, 30 years after that, we were becoming a much more ingrained feature of the criminal justice and the civil justice system. So it was time for these guidelines to be focused on. And the goal was to provide some guidance to improve the quality and to enhance the practice of forensic psychology and the perception of the discipline of forensic psychology. So these were drafted by the Committee on Ethical Guidelines for Forensic Psychology. And this was a committee that was put together by APA Division 41 and the American Academy of Forensic Psychology. I apologize, there's some acronyms here. The American Academy of Forensic Psychology is the training arm of the American Board of Forensic Psychology, which is the entity that oversees board certification. And they're both under the umbrella of ABAP, the American Board of Professional Psychology. Forensic psychology is one of 17 specialty boards under the ABAP umbrella. And you could see, if you've scanned ahead for the names here, that this committee was really led by several historic figures. So the chair was Steve Golding, who's a professor emeritus currently at the University of Utah. There were several co-chairs, Tom Grisso, who of course has made many contributions to the field, David Shapiro, who has been making contributions to the field for over 40 years, and Herbert Weissman, who forensic psychologist with wide-ranging expertise. And then the committee, there was Robert Fine, who was a psychologist with pretty extensive national security expertise, Kirk Halbrin, who continues to be a national leading figure in forensic mental health assessment and violence risk assessment, Judy McKenna, who's an experimental psychologist, did a lot of foundational work on eyewitness testimony, Norm Poitras, wide-ranging forensic expertise, including in ethics, and then Dan Schumann, who was an attorney, practiced at SMU for over 30 years. Lots of other people helped with it as well. These are the primary people. The specialty guidelines in 1991 were a joint statement of APA Division 41 and the American Psychology Law Society. So that might be confusing to some of you, particularly some of the younger audience members, or maybe some of you who are not familiar with the history. You might be asking, aren't Division 41 and APLS the same thing? So if you'll humor me for a bit, I'm going to take a slight diversion and just talk to you about the American Psychology Law Society and how it came about. And you could trace the roots to 1968, a small group of psychologists led by Jay Ziskin, who was a psychologist and a lawyer, met at the APA convention, which was held in San Francisco, to talk about their shared interest in developing a society for psychology and law. And shortly thereafter, in June of 1969, that was the ratification of the first constitution and bylaws of the American Psychology Law Society. Just a couple of data points about that. Dues were $2 per year at that time, and there were less than 80 members. And the group had difficulty deciding on the name, so they just stuck with the name that Jay Ziskin had used, which was American Psychology Law Society. But as a historical footnote, the name of the organization that actually got the most votes was the Society for Forensic Psychology. But they ultimately stuck with the American Psychology Law Society. You start seeing some growth in the organization. So by September of 1969, there were 101 charter members. They came from 28 different states. There were 2 medical doctors. There was a sociologist. The total assets of the organization in 1969, so if Jen Perillo, APLS Treasurer, is listening, this might be a shock, but the total assets were $202, which was $2 in dues from each of the 101 charter members. And you could see the continued growth of the organization. By 1971, there were 253 members. And an interesting data point is that lawyers constituted almost half of the members of APLS. 1974 was the first independent APLS conference. It was also held in San Francisco. There were less than 30 people at the entire conference. And the next key development was in 1980, there was some talk about proposing a new division for APA. And APA eventually approved Division 41, which is the Psychology and Law Division. And that became the home for many people who were interested in psychology and law. So in 1981, Division 41 held its first business meeting. John Monahan, who's a longtime professor at UVA Law School, was the president. And there was disagreement in the field about whether Division 41 should merge with the American Psychology Law Society. And Don Bursoff, who I mentioned earlier, was president of APLS in 1980-81. He supported the development of Division 41, but he was famously quoted as saying, "There will never be a Division 41 involving APLS while I'm president." Well, you know the history of the organization. In 1984, there was a merger, and APLS and Division 41 merged to become one organization, which is APLS/Division 41. Currently, we're a flourishing organization, over 3,000 members, a very strong student committee, an annual conference where we get over 1,000 people, and multi-million dollars in assets. So let's go back to the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists. So these guidelines were adopted by APLS in Division 41. They were endorsed by the American Academy of Forensic Psychology. So the executive committee of Division 41 and APLS voted to adopt these in March of 1991. They were not adopted by the American Psychological Association. And it was a relatively brief document. You can find the document. It was published in Law and Human Behavior. It's about 10 pages long, focused almost exclusively on clinical forensic psychology to the exclusion of research and teaching and consultation. And it was focused mostly on people who identified as forensic psychologists, as opposed to people who engage in forensic psychology. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's fast forward, and now we're going to talk about the guidelines that are currently in effect. And a little more than 10 years after the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists were adopted in 1991, a revisions committee was established jointly by APLS and the American Academy of Forensic Psychology in 2002. Again, there were lots of changes in the field in a relatively short period of time, in just a decade after the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists were adopted. So it was important to revise the guidelines. The chair of the committee was Randy Otto, national leader. I'm sure you're all familiar with Randy. Interesting footnote, I believe he's the only person in the history of our field to be president of APLS, the American Board of Forensic Psychology, the American Academy of Forensic Psychology, and the American Board of Professional Psychology. Randy established a committee. He wanted representatives from APLS, so he invited Saul Falero, who was a lawyer and a psychologist, Christina Studebaker, who was social psychologist, also was legally trained with a Master of Legal Studies degree. And from AAFP, he also got two representatives. So again, Steve Golding, who was the chair of the prior committee, and Lisa Pachowski, who has expertise in both criminal forensic psychology, civil forensic psychology, continues to make outstanding contributions to the field. And there was also a representative from Division 42, which is psychologists in independent practice, Jeff Youngren, University of New Mexico's own Jeff Youngren, who still a major contributor to the field, has expertise in several areas, including military psychology and ethics. This process of revising the initial set of specialty guidelines took 9 years. So between 2002, when the committee was established, it took until they were approved by APA, the Council of Representatives, on August 3rd, 2011. And so what that means is that these are official APA policy. And I'll talk more about the implications for that in terms of applicability and enforcement. The APA rules, in particular Rule 30-8.3, provides a 10-year shelf life for APA guidelines. So the sunset date of the current provisions was August 3rd, 2021. We're obviously past that. I'll circle back to talk about why that is. And as a side note, APA encourages shorter shelf lives, 5 years and 7 years, but these guidelines were given a 10-year shelf life. So that brings us to the current revisions committee, and this was established by APLS, the American Academy of Forensic Psychology, in July of 2020. I had the privilege of being appointed chair of this committee by APLS and AAFP. The president of APLS at the time was Jen Groskup. The president of AAFP was Julie Gallagher. And they asked me if I'd be willing to be chair of the committee, which of course I was very willing to do so. So I worked with the organizations, APLS and AAFP, to establish a committee that would be diverse, that would be representative. So I wanted the committee to have diversity in terms of subject matter expertise. So I wanted people to have clinical forensic expertise across criminal, civil, administrative, family law, military areas of practice. I wanted people with research expertise, people who had experience with teaching, research, and consulting. So I also wanted to focus on personal diversity and the importance of that in terms of the committee. So this is the current committee that we have. We have two representatives from APLS, Eve Brank. I'm sure many of you know Eve, former president of APLS at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Patty Zapp, longtime at John Jay, currently at Palo Alto, also former president of APLS. And then from AAFP, we have two members. We have Jim Mikesell, who's double board certified in forensic and rehabilitation psychology, lots of expertise in criminal and civil and some neuro areas. And Dan Neller, who has expertise. He's board certified in forensic psychology, has wide-ranging expertise, but of note in operational psychology. I again wanted a liaison from Division 42, a member this time fully from Division 42. So I asked Jeff Youngren if he'd be willing to serve again, and not sure what this says about his judgment after his experience for 9 years in the prior committee, but he agreed. Very grateful that he did because he brings a lot to the committee. And I also wanted an independent member who was part of those organizations, but represents private practice predominantly. And Antoinette Kavanaugh graciously agreed to be an independent member. And I appointed 3 senior advisors, consultants. So Kirk Halbrin, who I mentioned before, who's double board certified in clinical and forensic, of course, was on the prior the committee from 2011, excuse me. Art Nezu, who's a faculty member at Drexel, does not have a lot of forensic expertise. He's more of a community member, has a lot of APA expertise. And then Randy Otto. APA requires that at least 2 committee members served on the prior committee, so we satisfied that with Randy and Jeff. So what did we do once we established this committee? Well, we did several things pretty quickly. The first thing we did was we asked for an extension request from APA. So you might recall that I mentioned that the current version of specialty guidelines were set to expire in August of 2021. The committee wasn't established until June of 2020. That wasn't nearly enough time to revise the guidelines. So we asked for an extension, and that was granted by the APA Council of Representatives, and they extended the sunset date to December 31st of 2022. That's another date that has passed, so I will come back to that in a little bit. We also put together a revisions proposal. This is a formality. It's a required component when you are revising APA guidelines. We put this proposal in the fall of 2020, just a couple of months after the committee was constituted. And the point of it is to explain to APA why we need guidelines in this specialty area, what has changed in the interim since the current guidelines were adopted more than a decade ago, what the committee composition will be, how we will approach the revisions, and an estimated timeline. So that was approved by APA in November of 2020. Then we had our first public comment period. This sort of snuck up on us, and you're going to notice that I'm going to be transparent, probably to a fault throughout this presentation. We were not told by APA that a public comment period was being started. By the time I found out about it, we were already almost a month in, and it's only a 60-day comment period. So that may be why some of you missed it. We held this in early 2021. There will be additional comment periods. And again, as I mentioned, other venues for you to share your feedback throughout the revisions process. But we did get a good deal of feedback from that first public comment period. And then we made extension requests number 2. So I mentioned the process for revising guidelines takes a long time. The current guidelines took 9 years to revise. We realized that extending the guidelines just a little over a year to the end of 22 would not be sufficient. And a little peek behind the curtain here, besides actually revising the guidelines, there are multiple public comment periods which require more revisions. The guidelines need to go through all the boards and committees of APA, which requires more revisions. There's more public comment periods, which yet requires more revisions. And then finally, you have to get it onto the agenda for the Council of Representatives, and they have to vote on it. So this is a lengthy process. We knew a deadline of December of 22 would not be anywhere near sufficient. So we wanted the extension for two reasons. The first being the obvious that we just needed more time. But the second, and I'll come back to this in a bit, is that the APA Ethics Code is currently being revised. We didn't feel that we could complete the revisions to the specialty guidelines while the ethics code was being revised. So I will come back to that later. Another peek behind the curtain, when we made a request for an additional extension beyond 2022, we were initially denied. Our argument was that guidelines should not be revised while the ethics code is being revised, because that's often the foundational document, and that we needed more time. We were initially denied, but then the APA Board of Professional Affairs supported our request. They lobbied APA on our behalf, and we received an extension from the APA Council of Representatives in February of 2023. And they extended the life of the guidelines till the end of calendar year 2026. So here's a footnote that probably interests no one but me. But the specialty guidelines did actually expire on December 31st of 2022, and they were brought back to life in February, on February 24th of 2023. So there was a roughly 2-month period when the specialty guidelines were not in effect. But now we have a new sunset date of the end of calendar year 2026. And we'll talk about whether that'll be sufficient for us to do what we need to do. So before I get into the revisions and some of the considerations, I want to mention a couple of things related to the applicability and enforcement of the specialty guidelines. It seems to engender some confusion. So the first is the applicability. And to whom are the specialty guidelines applicable? Well, the ethics code, the APA ethics code, for example, is not binding on all psychologists. It is binding on APA members who agree to abide by it as a condition of membership. And the APA ethics code is binding on psychologists in states that have adopted the APA ethics code into state law, usually state administrative code. It's roughly 30 states have done that. It is not clear, well, let me start with this. The specialty guidelines for forensic psychology, the current ones, are APA policy, so they're applicable to APA members, and they're also applicable to practitioners in states that have adopted the specialty guidelines into state law. It's not clear to me the reach of that, but I'll talk more about that in a second. And then, are the specialty guidelines enforceable? Well, this hits on a key distinction between standards and guidelines. This is a distinction that's made by APA in Rule 30-8.1. And standards are considered to be enforceable, they're mandatory, and guidelines are considered to be ideals. They're considered to be aspirational. So these specialty guidelines as guidelines are intended to be aspirational. This is the language. I apologize for the long quote, but I think it's important. So while I'm talking, if you could just take a look at that quote. But basically, this is a disclaimer. These are from the guidelines that are currently in effect, that were adopted in 2011. They were published, as you can see, in 2013 in American Psychologist. But the committee that drafted these guidelines said that they didn't intend for the guidelines to serve as a basis for liability, disciplinary, and action. In other words, the guidelines were designed to be aspirational, which is consistent with APA policy. The problem with that is, anecdotally, I've heard of several courts across the country that have used the specialty guidelines as a basis of civil liability to hold psychologists liable in malpractice actions. And some states have made adherence to the specialty guidelines mandatory. Pennsylvania is one of them. That's my home state. And there is a statutory provision in the Pennsylvania Code that says that psychologists act in accord with APA standards and guidelines. And so there's not much that we can do about this as a revisions committee. We can make a recommendation that the guidelines be considered aspirational, but that cannot stop courts from adopting the guidelines in specific cases as a standard of care to assess liability, or stop states from adopting the guidelines into state code. There is some litigation in Pennsylvania related to the non-delegation doctrine. I won't get into it. That potentially could affect the applicability of specialty guidelines in Pennsylvania and maybe other states that are experiencing similar legislation, but that's down the road. So I mentioned that one of the things that is a barrier to our progress is the fact that the APA Ethics Code, it's the Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct, is currently being revised. The Ethics Code Task Force was constituted and charged in January of 2018. So by some quick math, they've been working for 6.5 years to revise the APA Ethics Code. I have my understanding, and I'm in contact with Linda Campbell, who's the chair of the Ethics Code Task Force, is that they are making progress in the revisions, but that the Ethics Code will not be finalized in the near future. So how's this relevant to what we do? Well, the specialty guidelines are rooted in the APA Ethics Code. You can almost think of the specialty guidelines as being an extension. In the current guidelines, it says that the specialty guidelines were informed by the APA Ethics Code. And certainly the specialty guidelines will cite and cross-reference the ethics code. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do that while the ethics code is being revised. So my committee, after a lot of debate, came to the consensus that we cannot finalize the specialty guidelines revisions until the ethics code is finalized. So we are waiting for that to take place. We are doing other work along the way, which I'll get to in a second. This is another relevant consideration that it relates to structure and format that is also somewhat of a barrier to our progress. APA now requires that each guideline is accompanied by several paragraphs on the rationale for it. In other words, why is this important, and is there a literature base supporting that guideline? And then several paragraphs illustrating the application of that guideline in specific contexts. This is a policy of APA that was implemented after the current specialty guidelines were developed. So the committee did not need to adhere to this policy. They just presented the guidelines. This could add tremendously to the length of the guidelines. So as a data point, I took a look at some other APA guidelines and how long they are. So this is just a random selection of current guidelines. The operational psychology guidelines, I had the privilege of being on that committee along with Dan Neller, who's on our committee. There's only 8 guidelines, and that is a document that is still over 20 pages long. Telepsychology guidelines, there's only 8, and that document is a little over 10 pages. The multicultural guidelines, there are 10 of those guidelines, and that document, it's right now in a Word document, you can find it on the APA site, is over 200 pages long with these additional paragraphs that I mentioned. The child custody guidelines, which were recently revised and improved, have 23 guidelines. It's about 30 pages. Our specialty guidelines have 59 guidelines right now. If we were to add several paragraphs on rationale and several paragraphs for illustrating the application, this would be a tremendously lengthy, some might say unwieldy document that might, in fact, have limited utility for practitioners because of the length of it. So this has implications for what the revised specialty guidelines will look like. And I'm not sure how things will unfold throughout the revisions process, but it's possible, for example, that if we fall in line with APA expectations and policy requirements, maybe the specialty guidelines will be renamed to be practice guidelines. Maybe we'll have fewer than 59 guidelines, but provide more examples. These are the key questions, and this is where I really want some input. What do we want the specialty guidelines to look like? Do we want a really long document that is comprehensive, that has these multiple paragraphs on rationale and application and illustration, or do we want a shorter document that's maybe heavier on examples that's still going to provide some guidance? So this is kind of an overarching question that we are dealing with. The specialty guidelines will most likely, the revised guidelines, endorse a broad definition of forensic psychology. I mentioned that the first version of the specialty guidelines just focused on clinical psychology, but the current guidelines, as you can see, focus on, they adopt a broader definition of forensic psychology, and also they're not limited to people who identify as forensic psychologists. It's for people who engage in the practice of forensic psychology, hence the name change from specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists to the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology. We will likely endorse a broad definition of forensic psychological activities. I'm not going to read this to you, another long quote. This comes from the current guidelines, but the emphasis is what I added. You can see that the guidelines currently apply to clinical practice, which is assessment and treatment. They apply to testimony in court and even through amicus briefs. They apply to adjudicative roles. They apply to consultation, research, and teaching. It's challenging to make the guidelines more meaningful in certain areas like teaching and research. So one of the questions that we face is, should the guidelines continue to address such a broad range of forensic activities? We also have some considerations relating to content. So I'm going to get through this. One is HIPAA. Given changes in federal legislation, case law, empirical work, there are some areas that we may need to add to the specialty guidelines. So you're probably familiar with HIPAA if you've been to a doctor's office in the past 10 plus years. And you know that one of the goals of HIPAA is to protect certain information. There is a debate about whether HIPAA applies in forensic context. There are some folks who think that HIPAA definitely applies. I would reference Bruce Borkowski, who's really done some outstanding work in the area of HIPAA. There are other people who aren't fully convinced that HIPAA applies. This is something that as a committee we're going to need to look at. So we want to talk to HIPAA experts, Bruce, and people on the other side of the aisle who maybe think that it does not apply, and try to reach a consensus about HIPAA in forensic contexts. Collateral information. This is the current provision in the current guidelines, and I think it needs a little bit more guidance. So, for example, when we talk about collateral information, I think it's important to know, how did the psychologist become involved in the case? Were they party retained, where they might fall under attorney-client privilege, or work product protection, or court appointed, where maybe that doesn't apply, perhaps another protection applies. What type of information is being accessed when we talk about collateral information? Is it protected, like medical records, or non-protected, like publicly available information? And what does collateral sources mean? Does that mean a collateral interview, or does it mean social media, the internet? See, these are things we need to address. This is the provision of multiple relationships. And you can see, if you're familiar with the guidelines, they're not strictly prohibited, but psychologists, forensic psychologists, are encouraged to be thoughtful about forensic practice. If you read through this language, which I will not read to you, is this strong enough? Should the guidelines take a stronger position about avoiding, when possible, multiple relationships? Is this too strong? There are areas of forensic psychology where those lines between an independent expert and a consultant are a little bit more blurred. So is that something that should be recognized in the specialty guidelines? So as you can tell, we've reached the part of the talk where I'm throwing a lot of considerations at you. Here's another one. In what ways should the revised specialty guidelines reflect diversity relevant considerations? There's not much attention to it in the current guidelines. You can see there's two provisions. One deals with general competence. The second one, 10.03, deals with the importance of considering diversity when selecting assessment measures. A lot has changed since the current guidelines were implemented. There is more attention, rightly so, on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So how should the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology address diversity, and what would that look like? Social justice is related, but it's a different consideration. Should the specialty guidelines address social justice? To me, this raises the question of what is the role of psychologists, forensic psychologists, vis-a-vis society at large? And what do we want our forensic specialty guidelines to mean? Test security. This is something that is sure to take center stage. The specialty guidelines emphasize the importance of ensuring the integrity and security of test materials. There's 3 different provisions. Maybe, though, the specialty guidelines, the revised ones, should make a clear distinction between test data and test stimuli and manuals. There are very different considerations when it comes to sharing those things. One could argue that sharing test data is important for transparency. When it comes to test stimuli and manuals, there are, of course, ethical obligations to protect test security. There are contractual obligations when you buy tests from a publisher to protect test security. Some of those obligations have been implemented into state law. It becomes much more complex. So, and of course, the line can be blurred where the test data are one and the same with the test stimuli. Think of an IQ form that has some of the test stimuli as well as the data. So some fields of psychology, of forensic psychology, are of the mind that we should not share our data as readily and not share test materials, test stimuli under basically any circumstances. So there's not a consensus in the forensic psychology field largely defined about how we should handle issues relating to test security. But if we do address test security more thoroughly, which I imagine we will, should we talk about strategies? Should it be an advisory document that includes strategies like protective orders to help guide forensic psychologists? Now, I'll go through these pretty quickly. More attention recently to bias, things like adversarial allegiance, the great work by people like Dan Murray, Mark Boccaccini, Neil Gowan-Smith, Lisa Guarnere, and others. The specialty guidelines address bias. Should they do so more explicitly? What about empirically based practices? Some of the other guidelines, the operational psych guidelines, the child psychology guidelines, have a specific guideline that encourages the use of empirically supported practices. Should the revised guidelines be firmer when it comes to that recommendation? Forensic assessment feedback. This is a really interesting, really interesting area. There's been some great work in this area. There was a recent presentation as part of this series by Lizzie Foster and Sharon Kelly. There's a recent article by Stan Brodsky and Julie Goldenson addressing the provision of feedback in forensic psychology, in forensic context. That is addressed in the current guidelines, but given the work that's been done, maybe we need to address it more thoroughly. And then, of course, technology. Lots of questions that were not as relevant when the current guidelines were adopted a decade ago. Social media. Randy Otto did a presentation on, I believe, January 23rd of this year relating to social media in forensic contexts. Remote assessments, which many of us adopted during COVID and still do. And APLS has a statement of recommendations, but should the guidelines address that more thoroughly? And then, of course, artificial intelligence. So what are the next steps? We got about 2.5 years until the specialty guidelines sunset at the end of 2026. So what are some things we can do? Well, continue to seek feedback in the current guidelines. That will be done informally and formally. Identify new content areas. We could start drafting the rationale and application paragraphs for maybe some of the guidelines that we think won't change. And then importantly, we need to identify areas in which there's a consensus, and just as importantly, areas where there's not a consensus. In the Specialty Guidelines Committee, we are not unilaterally making these decisions about what these guidelines say. We are in many ways a vessel. We are a conduit for the views of the field. So it's very important for us to get feedback and identify areas where there's a consensus and not a consensus. Well, what else can we do? Well, we can request another extension from APA. I'm concerned that it won't be granted based on some conversations, but we could do that. We could revise the specialty guidelines and just reference the current APA ethics code, not the one that's being revised. The problem with that is, as soon as the ethics code is finished being revised, then we will need to re-revise the specialty guidelines. And there's not an easy mechanism for doing that. So my committee, and this is a circumstance when I can speak for the committee, has considered that idea and does not think that it has a ton of merit. So here's the key question. What happens if we can't finish revising these guidelines by the end of 2026? Well, there's a few options. One, we could just let them lapse at the end of 2026 and keep working. Just keep revising the guidelines. The problem is then there will be no specialty guidelines in effect. That is a lack of guidance. And then what happens when we're done? Would APA welcome us back with open arms and say, now we're going to readopt or adopt those guidelines? Would they view them as new guidelines because they lapsed, or revised guidelines? That has implications for how we approach the revisions process. Here's a radical idea. There's a question mark after it. We could create standalone guidelines that are not adopted by APA. You might recall the first set of guidelines in 91 were not adopted by APA. If we did that, for example, if we had APLS and AAFP adopt or endorse the guidelines, we could not call them guidelines. That is an APA rule. We could call them a statement of recommendations. We would lack a meaningful enforcement mechanism, and they would have less authority. They would have less gravitas, so to speak, if they were not adopted as APA policy. So that's a whirlwind of information. There's a lot of information. You could see there's a lot of considerations. These are the two email addresses I mentioned earlier. I'll leave this up for a second. You could Google me. I imagine my that second Drexel email will come up. But at this point, I want to throw it back to Anthony and see if there are any questions or comments.
There sure are. Thank you so much, Dave, for that transparency and a refreshing update on understanding where the future of these long mentioned specialty guidelines are and the issues that we have ahead of us. We do have a number of questions, some comments about some of the things that you've brought up here about the specialty guidelines. If you want to offer more feedback or have more questions for Dr. DeMatteo, go ahead and enter those in the Q&A box. There's the QR code for you to fill out your survey if you want the APA CEUs. There is also the links to those in the chat box. Make sure you check those, bookmark it before you leave if you want to complete that survey after the webinar. Given that you just touched on what are some of the obstacles here, I'll go ahead and touch the most recent question here, which is somebody asking from your perspective, what is the probability from your perspective that the EPP-CC revision will be completed prior to the end of 2026?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me say, obviously, we're not going to be able to get through all of the questions. So please email me. You have my word. I will respond to each and every email I get with a response. I don't want to speak for the committee on this, so this is my opinion. I think that there's a very low probability that we will finish by the end of 2026. Let's imagine a world where we were finished the guidelines tomorrow. We revised the guidelines and we were happy with it tomorrow. Given the layers of review at APA, which can take a couple of years to get through, and all the required feedback and revisions, I think 2.5 years would probably be pushing it.
All the more to consider these plans with all this advanced, or it feels advanced. 2026 feels so far ahead, and yet it really isn't. But yes, thank you for that. A couple of people had questions about the representation on the committee and the development. So one question was, other than the independent private practice representative, how many individuals on the committee are actively engaged in clinical forensic practice outside of academic settings?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd have to look back through the roster real quickly. I can tell you that some of them are. I have a private practice outside of Drexel. I know Randy does work. Jim Mikesell is entirely a private practitioner. Dan Neller does some private work and some government work. So yeah, I think quite a few of the people are involved in private practice outside of an academic context.
And then related, somebody was curious about any representation. Why no committee members board certified in clinical neuropsychology, one of the largest subspecialties regularly practicing forensics. They add the context of, especially in the context of ABPP FP opposing expansion of ABPP to include forensic neuropsychology as a subspecialty. wouldn't the committee want to include clinical neuropsychologists in the creation of version of these APA policies under which they practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can tell you that there was no systematic exclusion of our forensic neuro colleagues. I certainly want to have a dialogue with representatives from the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology, which is the board certifying group of ABAP, and other people who do clinical neuropsychology. So there was maybe that was something we should have more explicitly considered. I can tell you that some of the people, we don't have anyone board certified in clinical neuro on the committee. We do have people with neuro expertise, and I think the committee would be open to having several discussions with people who are board certified in clinical neuro and other people who do that type of work.
Regarding the HIPAA concerns or questions, someone asked, why not petition the Office of Civil Rights for more guidance on HIPAA rather than having a tertiary group right guidelines that OCR might not agree with?
Yeah, it's a great idea. So that is something that has come up in our discussions, and it's something that we are considering doing, and something authoritative to have a statement that we could rely upon in our guidelines, I think would be very useful. It's a great idea.
Somebody asked, based on this conversation, so does the APA ethics code not apply to forensic psychologists who are not a member of APA and not in a state that's formally adopted those measures?
There are psychologists who fall through the gaps. So again, the APA ethics code, if you're a member of APA, it applies to you. And then there's roughly 30 states at last count that have adopted the APA ethics code into their state law. Again, usually administrative code, sometimes in case law. But if you're in a state where you're not an APA, if you're in a state that has not done so and you're not an APA member, I'm not sure what the mechanism would be by which you would be bound by the APA ethics code. Perhaps your state organization might have a rule about that. But that would differ by state.
Certainly, yes. And what are the implications of the guidelines being accepted as revised versus new guidelines if they lapse and then get readopted by APA?
Yeah, I don't fully know, to be honest. We've been focused on other things, but I do know that when you're proposing what are considered new guidelines, there's more administrative work that you need to do. There's more bureaucratic barriers that you need to get over to justify why the field needs these new guidelines. I tend to think, and I would defer to people like Randy and Jeff and Kirk, who have been involved in prior versions of this committee, that even if our guidelines lapsed, I think APA would likely view them as a readoption of guidelines, which would save us a little bit of administrative work. But I'm not entirely clear.
Well, one could hope in a vacuum after all of that less administrative work would be better, given how far the advancements would be at that point.
Yes.
Somebody asked, any thoughts, will the guidelines differentiate things related to civil versus criminal forensic evaluations?
Yeah, it's another good question. I mean, the goal of guidelines generally is to have broad applicability across contexts. The problem with that, as we know, is that there are different considerations in criminal, civil, administrative, military, in all of these different contexts. And so it's not exactly clear to me how our guidelines should approach some of those nuances. My guess would be, and I'm not speaking for the committee here, is that we might have a broad general guideline, but then in the paragraphs where we are illustrating the application of that guideline, we would illustrate the application in various forensic contexts.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. We have a couple of people, it seems like, that have thrown out some ideas of their own perceptions of what they would like to see addressed. So perhaps your thoughts on some of this. Somebody that adds, thank you for this informative presentation. One thing I'd love clearer guidance on is how to handle situations in which opposing experts in adjacent professions outside of psychology are essentially engaging in the practice of forensic psychology and in a problematic way. Example, offering forensic opinions not grounded in forensic mental health assessment principles. I encounter this with master's level mental health professionals, physicians, even vocational experts, sometimes acting fairly egregiously. Any portion of the guidelines that would address this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that's something that I think would probably fairly significantly expand the guidelines. It also becomes an issue of jurisdiction and reach. What authority would these guidelines have over master's level practitioners who are not bound by APA policy, who are not bound by some of the licensure restrictions that apply to psychologists. So we can make recommendations of things, but we wouldn't be able to, and maybe that's the thrust of the question. We could make some recommendations about what we can do as psychologists, but we wouldn't be able to regulate those other professionals.
How about addressing issues in the area of forensic supervision or offering guidance for addressing unethical conduct by forensic colleagues, such as waiting for a shared case to resolve?
Yeah, that's important. And that's something that's developed more too over the past 10 plus years. So of course, the APA Ethics Code has some provisions about how you should handle ethical concerns with colleagues. But we know that the rules are different. The considerations are different when it comes to a forensic context or the forensic contexts. So again, this might be an example where we have some general guidance and then we use the illustration paragraphs to offer more guidance in specific contexts.
Any changes or clarification of the dual role of legal consultation and expert testimony on the same case?
So that was one of the slides that I included because I imagine we're going to have to give more thought to that provision. Again, there are some subspecialties of forensic psychology where that line is blurred a little bit more. You could think, for example, some military psychology. And so, again, it's how broad or narrow do we want these guidelines to be? So I would like to see more guidance in the guidelines. Of course, that will be a decision made by the committee from feedback that we receive from the field.
Thank you. We are past the top of the hour, so we might have time for one or two more. Of course, we have way more than that here in the talk. Somebody did ask.
So Anthony, can I just, is there a way I can get a copy of those questions? Or do people have to email me separately?
Well, they can email you separately. My understanding is the quick and dirty part that I can do is at least get a screenshot of some of these questions to make sure we have the text. But yeah, the way the system goes, the questions get wiped after this. But I'll go ahead and do what I can for you in that regard.
Thank you.
Yes. Somebody asked if knowing of states that include the specialty guidelines in their state codes as enforceable, same as APA, ECC. If I'm looking up at one of our colleagues noted that only one state, their understanding is only one state enforces the specialty guidelines, which would therefore then be Pennsylvania, is my understanding. But any clarification there?
No, I don't have additional clarification. What I can tell you is that some of the students at Drexel in our JD Ph.D. program have expressed a willingness, some of whom I think might be on this presentation, to look into it with a little bit more detail. We need that information. We need to know the reach and the applicability of the specialty guidelines. So sometimes it's tricky because it's hidden in certain aspects of the code, but they're legally trained, and so I'm pretty confident they would be able to find it.
All right, I have made sure to reserve all of these questions for you to be able to see later. And of course, if anybody has any questions for Dr. DeMatteo, he's more than welcome to, more than willing to be transparent with you and respond to your questions directly to him. But one final kind of more meta wrap up here, so to say. Somebody said that they've chaired clinical practice guidelines and a professional practice guideline and found the bureaucracy and process overwhelming. So given all of this, do you think the process is clear and is it necessary from your experience?
So again, I'm going to share my opinions and not necessarily the opinions of the committee. I find it laborious. I find it not particularly nimble, not particularly responsive. So what's the good news, right? I think that multiple layers of review do serve a purpose. Of course, right? Getting feedback from diverse constituents and the diverse boards and committees have considerations we haven't thought of. But at some point, you need to make decisions, you need to move on. The field needs guidance. So I don't know that I am a huge proponent of the way that it's done at this point, but I'm hoping that throughout this process, I've had some discussions with APA, that there might be some ways that we could streamline this process, make it a little bit less bureaucratic.
Dr. DeMatteo, Dave, thank you so much. First of all, of course, for your contributions to these specialty guidelines. Second, for you are the one that came up with this being a discussion for the Law and Mental Health series, which clearly from the amount of questions on the attendance here was something that really resonated and was of great interest to the people here and the people in the field. And then third, just for your candor and your information here on all of this behind the scenes and what kinds of things we still need to address. It's really much appreciated.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. That wraps up this week's University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you next week when Dr. Carol Holden will be discussing issues of juvenile violence risk assessment. We hope to see you then for another great discussion of issues in behavioral health and the law. Until next time.